As we all know, cost of doing business has increased and precipitously since 2020 and COVID-19. And unfortunately, the markets are not reflecting that increase in cost. This puts a lot of pressure on our ranches, who already are, dealing with high land values and development, and now also have to deal with these high costs of production. And how can carbon markets help? Well, it's another revenue stream. We can provide some financial support. We have two different types of payment systems, so we can do upfront payments to help with the cost in changing practice, and also on an outcome-based payment. Marketing is one that I think that's really important and maybe underutilized. We need to be able, Florida ranchers are the original conservationists, and we need to be able to tell that story and connect to the public and maybe drive some new markets. And I think that's something that we can help facilitate. Agronomic support, we have a great agronomy team with all kinds of unique experiences and expertise, and we can also rely on the 150 years of agronomic knowledge from ER International. And then soil improvement is something I think that's really important. And none of this is really worthwhile unless the practice changes that we're making are going to create a demonstrable improvement in production or an input cost for the ranch. These practices need to be able to help the bottom line within a few years. So one of the biggest challenges and hurdles is soil sampling. And anybody who's done soil sampling knows that it's laborious, it's expensive, it takes a long time, and it's not necessarily the most reliable or consistent. So it's kind of a race now to figure out how can we create the best or most efficient soil sampling protocols so that we can measure soil organic carbon the most accurately. And so what we're doing is we're trying to invest in researching some new technology. Proximal sensing is one that's probably going to be the most promising in the short term. We hope that remote sensing is something that we can build with the correct data, accurate models with, and then also building new models. So we have a team of data scientists, and we're working to improve the models that are already available and then potentially develop new ones if needed. So in summary, carbon markets are a mechanism in which we can get non-agriculture money funneled back to producers, and while adopting practices that will ultimately improve production. Carbon programs were initially designed around commodity crops, but livestock operations have been very popular, and of course, Florida has unique challenges, but also opportunity to be creative and take advantage. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, first I want to give a shout out to my team that I work with. Hillary Swain is also a very strong collaborator on all of the carbon work we've been doing at Buck Island Ranch. You can see here we work with a lot of different institutions and agencies on understanding the carbon cycle on Buck Island Ranch. So PES programs are a potential way to get land protected. And so when I was thinking about a carbon services program, I was reflecting on our work with a payment for water services program in South Florida. And we learned a lot of lessons from this program. One is that it has to be feasible to implement over large landscapes. It has to be profitable for ranchers to implement these practices. It has to be cost effective for the buyers of the services, and it has to be credible. In this program, ranchers are getting paid to provide water retention and nutrient removal services above and beyond what they would do with traditional practices. And these projects are improving biodiversity through the enhanced wetland habitat, and also protecting downstream ecosystems like Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. The South Florida Water Management District manages this program, and they contract with a third-party entity, which happens to be our lab at Archbold at Buck Island Ranch. And so we monitor these projects and go out and monthly and collect water level data, rainfall data, and weir elevations to show the services are being provided. So I really believe in keeping working lands working, so these type of programs that provide some incentives to ranchers are really important for conservation. And I think an exciting goal is to think about how we can have a program for a payment for carbon services program on agricultural lands that's profitable, feasible, and credible. So first, I just wanted to go over a bit about carbon services. And I'm focusing on ranch lands. These are the major greenhouse gases produced by a ranch. So we have carbon dioxide. It's emitted from plant respiration and microbial respiration. We also have CO2 that is taken up by the land through photosynthesis. Methane is released from cattle as they digest grasses. And by the way, this is through burps, not the other end. And then there's also methane that I call environmental methane that's from wet soils and wetlands. And then there's nitrous oxide that is from cattle excrement, fertilizer application, and microbes. And you notice here that I'm not really I'm not focusing on environmental methane as an emission to reduce, because that's a natural source and we wouldn't want to drain wetlands to remove those emissions. So there's a couple different ways we could define carbon services. One way is to reduce our emissions. And so it's another way we could do that is to increase our uptake of CO2. So we're really concerned about the net sequestration. We want the uptake to be greater than our emissions. And then the last way is we can protect the soil carbon stock and the root biomass. And that's a large reservoir of carbon on the ranch. And we do that by avoiding land conversion. So how do we measure these carbon services in a way that's cost effective and buyers and sellers feel is fair and credible? For that, we need to be able to assess the carbon stock through time. And there's different ways to do this. One is by labor-intensive soil sampling. I agree with what Eric said. Florida soils are very sandy. They have high spatial variability. This, coupled with our hot, humid climate, means our soils do not accumulate carbon very quickly. So really, it takes a lot of soil sampling to get a good picture of the soil carbon stock. Another way is through remote sensing, and third is modeling. Looking at remote sensing, I think there's a lot of promise here. We did do some preliminary analyses on the ranch looking at a satellite product. This is EVI, or Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a measure of vegetation greenness. And we wanted to see how well that correlated to carbon stock. And we found, the best relationship we could find was only explaining about 30% of that variation. So that's not really good enough for quantifying that service. But I think we just scratched the surface here, and with all of the new hyperspectral products and other remote sensing products available, we need to look at more different analyses of how the remote sensing can be used to monitor carbon stock. In terms of modeling, current models don't work in Florida, and I've talked to several different modeling groups, and so we ran a recent model at Buck Island Ranch that showed values that completely did not make sense until we utilized data from 1,400 soil samples, data from eddy covariance towers, which you see here, and you're looking at $70,000 worth of equipment on the screen here, and takes specialized expertise to run, and water level data. And then after we inputted all that data into the model then began to show values that made sense. Research is needed to understand to what extent do proposed climate-smart practices enhance net sequestration in Florida. So here I've listed some of these practices that show promise for increasing carbon capture in our grasslands and wetlands. There's also cattle feed additives that you can give cattle to reduce their methane emissions. But with all of these practices in a carbon credit program or a payment for carbon services program, we need to show that with the practice is providing an above and beyond service. And that's what the PES carbon programs would want to pay for, is that above and beyond service, or that's also called additionality. We must also consider trade-offs and synergies. So I'm really worried about trade-offs, especially with biodiversity. So there's always a danger when you're really emphasizing one ecosystem service, such as carbon, you might have negative impacts on biodiversity. And so one of the things I heard yesterday was tree planting. And I think, you have to be really careful with where you plant trees. We don't want to lose our grasslands and turn them into forests. That would be really bad for biodiversity. So carbon complexity equals more science needed. One way we could maybe move forward is to have representative verification sites where we have intensive data collection for model calibration, validation, and ground truthing, and get the models correct and working so that we can model scenarios of traditional management versus innovative climate smart management. I think we need to really maintain, we want to look at above and beyond carbon services that are provided, when these climate smart practices are implemented. So easements that are already protected are not eligible unless you do some management changes on those easements. So because PES requires additionality. Restoration of timberlands show promise, so scientists feel very confident about estimating the carbon stored in a tree, but we have to be careful about tree planting density in these cases. We want to achieve biodiversity goals at the same time as we would plant trees in timberlands. And the jury's still out on grazed grasslands. We're still looking at our net sequestration and to understand if our uptake offsets our emissions. So that's it.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you.
All right, let's give a round of applause to our panelists here. It's off at the moment, so turn it on. So we're going to just do a standard Q&A. We're going to open up the floor for questions. So you can raise your hand if you have a question for the panelists. Please introduce yourself, and if you have a question for a specific panelist, let us know, or for the whole panel, let us know. And Pat's going to walk around with the mic. So who's got a question based on these opening presentations?
Here's one. Great. Bring the mic here. Hi, thank you. This one's for Nori, and I have heard about transfer of development rights. We use it in different kinds of development schemes in Florida. And this is just kind of a how do you avoid pitfalls of it question. Sometimes when they've done it, the charge is, well, the development put in some kind of development, and they had to get a trade-off, and so they paid someone to maintain a nice place over here, and so spatially, you get the development and they get the park. How do you kind of avoid that kind of a conflict when you're trying to, because it's a very useful strategy.
In a perfect world, and I'm also obviously stressing don't wait for perfection. You close the door on those loopholes. I live in a city, for example, to get a right to develop in the city I live in. You have to build a certain amount of social housing, below market housing, and you have to build it within a very, very small area. Like most of the social housing now gets built into market housing. You can't go that far. Now, if we're going to do ecosystem services, what I'd love the work in the background behind the one table to be an analysis of the community's food and water supply chain, and make that area boundary reflect the food and fiber supply chain. Now, that's not really easy to do, but if you started there, I think you might get to a place that's quite pleasing.
Yeah, and in Florida, we use service boundaries to try to make sure that it doesn't get externalized.
So do the food and fiber and water supply version of the service boundaries. Does that make sense?
This is not my COVID wipe, it's my cold wipe.
So I have a question about scale, particularly in Florida, because we're talking about the fact that our soils are, have issues, right, with the ability to store carbon. So when we're talking in particular about, rangeland, like what kind of scale are we talking about to be meaningful? 10,000 acres, 1,000 acres?
So, that's a great question. And with our program right now, we try to keep a minimum of 500 acres to make sense for the soil, because we pay for all the soil sampling stuff. So in order to make that, kind of economy of scale, we try to keep things around 500 acres. Now, with that said, if there's ranches that are within a similar area and they're, got some smaller ones, we can kind of aggregate and make that work. But for right now, we're working, we're trying to stay at least above 500 acres.
Eric, are those limitations practical on the part of agorocarbon, or is it a scientific limitation? Because I think, right, there's the, what's useful in terms of the amount of carbon that's stored, but really what the corridor is talking about is carbon markets for land protection, and every acre counts, but there are surely practical limits to how small an area a carbon market would work on.
Yeah, so that's based on Agoro's, ability or what makes sense for us. I think the landowners would have to decide what makes sense for them.
To put on my NORI hat, we've also delivered to date, just in a pilot phase, about $2,700,000 to farmers and ranchers, and we've really tried to be very aggressive about building a marketplace that farmers can directly enroll in instead of having to go through brokers, and buyers can directly buy from, so that more of the price a buyer pays for a credit gets to the landowner. And even with all of our efforts to do that, and I think we've done a lot of things right, we are finding that just the scope of the data collection you have to do, we're pretty, whenever somebody comes to us that's less than 750 acres, we say, but you know what you can do? Can you get together with your neighbors and make one project? A lot of the sampling can be random selected. And in another file, I work for a community in Canada called Alice Canada. And the biggest food retailer and hotel owner in Canada makes a donation, and Alice works with, sets up communities, and ideally crop producers, ranchers, but what they are all is neighbors, and then supports them to plot a path forward they want to pursue together, and it's really working beautifully.
Betsy, did you want to give it? Yeah.
So a paper recently came out by Environmental Defense Fund, and they had a really good idea about these regional carbon market. And because the climate and the soil types are very, like, a strong driver of how much climate or how much carbon you can capture, and they recommended having sort of large regional areas where you track projects within that region, and then you look at the effectiveness of the projects at the regional scale. So if you had a successful program, you would see at the regional scale that you're increasing carbon uptake in that region. So I was kind of, when I read that, I thought of a carbon shed and sort of like a watershed scale carbon market project.
Okay, go ahead.
Greg Connect with the Nature Conservancy. And you are all kind of hitting around, that question of scale, and when you say regional, Betsy, I mean, is that we've heard 500, 750. I think in Florida it may be bigger than that, because our experience has been the monitoring cost, the upfront monitoring cost for verification is really expensive. And, so then it starts eating into the actual, payment for producers. So I wonder if you took your, we'll call it a perfect plot of what we could potentially get in Florida, and overlaid that with a value of, and subtract out what the monitoring cost would be and what, all that would be, and potential changes to practices, or is there a cost to producers? What's the net? I mean, where do we end up? Because that to me is at the end of the day, if it's $1, and I don't know, for a producer, I don't know what that number is, but that to me is where we got to get to, is what's the number that makes it worthwhile for a producer to say, I'll do. The additionality makes sense. The monitoring, if we got to make it at a big enough scale that it's absorbed by multiples, that to me is where we need to go.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And one of the things that I want to get, in talking with Betsy and others, I want to understand, like, what is that price point? Like, what are the things that need to happen for us to make this an opportunity for ranchers? That's the feedback that we're looking for right now. I also want to say, like, we've tried to make it as simple as possible, in the sense that, again, we cover all the cost of monitoring and sampling, and then we provide a floor price, a guaranteed price minimum for every ton of carbon sequestered, so that at least the grower or the rancher knows about a minimum price that they're going to get. If the price goes up, we'll match that. So.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Hillary?
So we talked a bit about spatial heterogeneity, but the other challenge is the temporal aspect of this. My understanding is NORI is a 10-year contract. I might be wrong on that. And we know how hard it is to move the needle in these Florida sandy soils, not so much in the peat soils. So, and then you're signing up for a floor. I'm speaking as someone who's managing a piece of land. And, 10 years may not be enough to move the needle. So are we looking, and another thing from a regional basis would be, what is the temporal length over which these contracts would have to be effective to know that you are having an impact? And then, for a landowner, you have no idea about the other opportunities that are going to come up over time. And a 10 to 20 year project for a PES on carbon, that's, I know from the water PES contracts, it's incredibly complex contracts. How do you get out of this? What is the commitment? So I'm sure that these are well thought through in the carbon market, but I just know how difficult it is for a landowner. If you sign up for this contract and, you have some change in endangered species vulnerability, also, in terms of regulations, how is that going to be taken care of? We've learned a lot from PES to know that the contracting is going to be complicated. And to what extent are you thinking about the time frame, and what extent are you thinking about the complications that we have with all the other trade-offs and issues over time?
No. Can I kick that one? You follow up with me. I've probably in the last year been invited to speak to maybe hundreds of farmers and ranchers just about contracting. And I think the best presentation I ever saw about when someone comes to you to join a carbon market, what should you ask? What are the questions you should ask? What should think about? Was given by a lawyer in Texas I saw last week who's also a rancher. So make sure that I get you a copy of his presentation materials, because it's the best I've ever seen. And the bottom line is, and this is, apply this test to me, everybody you know. If anybody comes to you and says, come join my carbon market, ask him to explain every detail. And you can give them 3 chances to say something you understand, because, we're carbon market geeks and we've got our own language just like software types do. But if you still don't want to understand what I'm saying after the third time, you don't care what I'm saying. Like if I can't explain it so that you can understand it, don't do it.
So I think my follow-up question is, the potential for development is so high for many of these land
Yeah.
areas. So we're not talking about, sort of remote rural areas with high carbon sequestration where there isn't an encroaching Fort Lauderdale or something coming down the road. So how have you found those carbon markets work on wildland-urban interfaces or places that are extremely vulnerable? Are people less likely to sign up in those situations?
It depends. It's not, there isn't a general, but I want to give you two pieces of information. The second one, I didn't realize until maybe a couple of years ago, which is kind of weird. The first one is the reason Nori's contract is 10 years is I think the shortest term you need, the shortest to see whether the things is working is maybe 7 if you're lucky. But there tends to be a 7 to 12 year interval if you're doing everything the right way, which is hard to figure out. Somewhere around year 10, you know whether or not you're on track. So for those contracts, we decided that I don't have any problem with the goal of permanent carbon storage, but probably the way to achieve permanent carbon storage is to start thinking in terms of ton years. So Nori has introduced a contract that says 10 ton years, and the hope is that you will things will be going well, so you'll re-enroll for the next 10 ton years and the next 10 ton years. And we also want the people in the marketplace to get the idea that if they want you to maintain your land in a certain practice for 100 years, you should have a reasonable expectation of a payment that is more equivalent to market value every 10 years. So that's what we bring to that. Now go to the urban development thing. Here's the thing that I'm struggling with. I can show you lots of examples where converting ag land, especially sort of intensively cropped land, to urban development before you account for the disturbance that goes with the construction project, once it's converted over, it's sequestering more carbon. So I can imagine a future where people are saying, how do you change how you manage the construction project because this conversion is storing more carbon? And so what does that mean? I want to loop it back, which also means establishing your protected wildlife and watershed corridors is even more important in that context. Does that make sense the way I said it? I think if we get this right, the question is whether you're storing carbon, water, and reducing water production, and these contracts or easements that are denominated in terms that are restricting the use of the land won't stand up, because you can go to urban development and store more carbon.
Thank you, Alden. We're going to have to wrap up the conversation now. I want to just, do you have a quick follow-up, Betsy? No? Okay. Let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists. And I know there's some ideas still on the table that we're going to do our last sticky note exercise, so you should be really good at this by now. From this carbon session, we want you to do what's good, what's missing, what's unclear. We're not going to take a break. Just take 5 minutes, write your notes, and we'll bring them up to the third board. Thank you.
No one can leave the room till we're done. Got 20 more minutes. Then we promise to let you go.
A brief announcement while you're working on the sticky notes. There's a hotel room key card that was found by the podium just after lunch. If it might be yours, come and try it only on your room.
Right, so as people are jotting down their thoughts, we do want to do a few things as we begin to close the day, and appreciate folks who've stuck with us the entire day, because we really appreciate that kind of commitment and the kind of ongoing kind of how we can tie the, or link the threads across the conversation. So we want to talk a little bit about tracking progress on conservation and the like. And so we asked John Otting and Viv Slater to give just a bit about that as we begin to close. I'm going to turn it to Josh for a few final words, and then we're going to wrap. And so John, I think you just came back in the room, so I'm ready to hand it over to you. And I'll hand you a mic.
Come on up, John. I'll get your slides going.
Okay, you get a mic there. Okay, good. And feel free, if the speaker's okay with it, if you get your ideas and you want to just quickly put them up there and run back, that's okay. We know you're all listening, so.
Go to it. I'm just going to click on the right arrow to move it along. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm John Otting with the Florida Natural Areas Inventory in Tallahassee. And it's been a long day with a lot of meaty information that we're all trying to digest. So bear with me as I show some more charts and graphs and things. So first, a little bit about who we are if you're not familiar with us. We are part of Florida State University. We are Florida's Natural Heritage Program. There's a natural heritage network of programs like ours in all 50 states, all the Canadian provinces, several Latin American countries. And we all follow similar methodology and database to track rare species, natural communities throughout our states. So that's one of our core missions. We also do a lot of conservation planning and analysis. But in addition to that, what I'm here to talk about today is our conservation lands database. We track conservation lands boundaries for the state of Florida. So all the state land managing agencies partner with us to provide their acquisition information. We maintain those boundaries for them. But in addition to the state lands, we also have federal, local, and private lands. So this goes back to 1981 when we were founded. FNA was actually founded as part of the CARL, Conservation and Recreation Lands in action when it came into place in 1981. And we began tracking managed area boundaries at that point on paper quad maps along with our rare species occurrences. Around 1991, we transitioned that into a GIS database. And then in 2001, there was a big shift with the onset of Florida Forever to be able to track acquisitions at the parcel level. So prior to that, we really were just looking at managing boundaries, not necessarily ownership parcels. So it wasn't easy to say, how much was acquired at this point in time. But now that we're tracking that with Florida Forever, we're able to do that at least for Florida Forever acquisitions, and what we're now working towards is to be able to do that similar sort of tracking with all conservation lands going forward. We had our first online conservation lands web map in 2005, and we've continued to build on those, and we now have a series of maps on our website that you can see a variety of natural resource information in addition to the conservation lands boundaries. So one of the things that we get asked sometimes is how we define a managed area. And I apologize, I tend to use managed area, conservation land interchangeably. That's just kind of our terminology and how we track this. But we do have some specific criteria for what gets into our managed areas database. First of all, and a lot of this is common sense, but some of this is pretty technical. So obviously a significant portion of the property needs to be in a natural or semi-natural state. And here is a key: the property must have a managing agency or entity, which could be a private landowner, that has a formal commitment to manage for conservation. So there are lands out there that are effectively being managed for conservation but don't have any sort of formal status, and those currently don't get tracked. I mentioned that we include federal, state, local, and private managed areas. I should point out that it doesn't include all public lands, so you can imagine there's university lands, prisons, other sorts of government lands that aren't really conservation lands. So this is not a public lands database, it's conservation lands. We do include fee simple, less than fee, mitigation banks, so a variety of different types of ownership and management. Currently, our requirements are for a less than fee or those sorts of easements that they need to be in perpetuity. So they don't meet our criteria if they're sort of a temporary or payments for ecosystem services. But I'll come back to that. And also, we track them by the managing agency. That's why we call it a managed areas database. We're really focused on the managing agency and their activities on the land. And it's not always the same as the owner of the land. There's cases where one agency technically owns the land, another agency is managing the land. Sometimes it's federal versus state. So we're more focused on who's managing. So a couple of notable examples that we sometimes get questions about. Department of Defense lands are generally included because, as you know, they have a significant conservation component to their mission, and they are some of our really strongest conservation partners in terms of land management in Florida. So if you think about Eglin Air Force Base, Avon, and several others, where there are some pretty large natural landscapes that are being managed for conservation compatibly with the DoD mission. As I mentioned before, some of the things we're not including, regulatory sorts of easements or set-asides, limited terms, payments for ecosystem services. I'll come back to that at the end. So here's what this looks like. This is our conservation lands by manager, federal, local, private, and state. You see there. Another thing we're able to do from all of this is each year we provide this summary of conservation lands report. We try to get this out in advance of each legislative session because that's when you get a lot of questions about how many lands are conserved, what percent of the state, which agencies are involved. And so we provide this sort of accounting each year to provide that information to the public. So here's a quick summary of what that looks like currently. Federal, state, local, and private in total are currently at about 32% of the state of Florida. You can see that state is the largest component, 17%. Now that there are some fairly large state-owned lands or state-managed lands, but also, of course, the large federal, the national forests, national parks, and DoD. So I mentioned earlier that once Florida Forever began, we started shifting to tracking by parcels. And what that's allowed us to do is provide more detailed tracking of acquisitions over time, as well as funds allocated towards acquisitions. So this graph just shows you acquisitions for Florida Forever by year. And you can see a lot of activity, of course, in the first several years of Florida Forever when it was fully funded. Then about the time of the recession, the funding dried up for a few years, and it was really kind of sparse and inconsistent for several years, and then we're just now getting back into a cycle where we're going to see those numbers going back up. So some of the other things we're able to do with this information, and I don't expect you to be able to read any of this is just kind of examples. We're also providing information on Florida Forever project boundaries. So we maintain the boundary information. We also provide information on the natural resources that are found on each of those projects, and that helps the Acquisition and Restoration Council in their evaluations of projects and their rankings of projects for acquisition. That's what you see on the left-hand side. It's what we call the bubble sheet, which kind of shows you at a glance the resource value of any project on the list. And then on the right-hand side is what we call an acquisition progress report, where we're basically counting the beans and able to report on acres of each natural resource type that have been acquired on Florida Forever lands and other lands within the state. We've just recently, at the request of DEP's Division of State Lands, developed this web map that's now available on our site for the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So this allows you to see the corridor in an interactive map and also look at the conservation lands and Florida Forever projects that overlay the corridor. So you can kind of interact with that information and query that down to the local level. So next steps. This is what I was kind of alluding to earlier. Our goal now and what we're talking with our partners about doing going forward is not only tracking the Florida Forever acquisitions, but all conservation lands now at the parcel level with closing dates, so that we're able to do that kind of detailed tracking over time and really track progress in a more comprehensive way. We're also talking about the development of what we're calling, for lack of a more exciting term, a supplemental conservation lands database. So this is where we're going to try to start capturing some of these other types of conservation regulatory easements. So, for example, if a county is working with a large-scale development and they're requiring a set-aside of 50 acres or something as part of that, we want to track that as best we can. It's a lot harder to do than it is the large-scale conservation lands because, you know, these things are scattered throughout the state in a lot of different development orders with different local governments. But we're going to try to start tracking that. And of course, payments for ecosystem services or other sorts of temporary easements on the land, we're going to try to capture more of that information. And the reason this kind of stuff is important is because when we're doing modeling, for example, for Florida Forever to say, here's where your highest priorities are for acquisition, we need to know that these places are out there so that we can kind of take them off the table and say, you know, we don't need to be spinning our wheels thinking about these places as opportunities. They're already to some extent covered. Let's focus on the other areas that don't have any of this status. So that's why this is increasingly important. And finally, I wanted to mention, and Mallory mentioned this yesterday, we're talking with the Wildlife Corridor Foundation about developing an online dashboard that really tracks comprehensively Florida's conservation progress on the corridor specifically, but also statewide as a whole. And that's going to allow all of us to have kind of a quick one-stop place to go and see how are we doing? How far have we gotten towards these goals that we've all been talking about over the past year, over the past 6 months, over the past 5 years? And that's what all of this additional work is building towards. So we're excited about that. I think it's going to be a great opportunity. And if you want to get in touch, here's more information. Our website, again, has a lot of the data available for download or viewing in a web map. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's have, thanks John so much. Let's have Viv come on up and do her piece, and then we'll see if there's questions, and then we'll do a quick wrap. So John, if you don't mind just hanging up here, we'll give you a chair. And Viv, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for that presentation. We're really excited about the dashboard that you guys are developing and adding all those future supplemental conservation lands in. It's really, really important. I am Vivian Slaughter. I am the Director of Data and Technology at Archbold Biological Station, and I'm going to talk today about how we're using data to inform and enable conservation. So I'm going to touch on 2 different projects that we've been working on at Archbold. And the first project is intended to inform conservation by looking at land cover trends. So here we use the NLCD, the National Land Cover Data Set, which is a USGS product, and they create a land cover classification, which you can see in the chart over there, every 2 to 3 years. You can see the years that they have created it for listed there. And yesterday in the panel session, Steve Brumby from Impact Observatory was talking about how the most recent land cover classification is from 2019, and that is this data set right here. So it's a really great data set. It's based on Landsat imagery, which has a 30-meter resolution. It's a decision tree-based land cover classification, and they do report their accuracy, which is really, really good. You can see 91% overall accuracy in 2016. They have not reported the 2019 accuracy yet. So again, with that delay. So what we did with this is we took this data set and reclassified it into 3 classes. Developed, which are those 4 classes listed there, crops, which is just the cultivated crops layer, and then everything else. And so everything else here we called natural. Some of it may not be particularly natural, but it is corridor compatible, and that was the main thing that we were focusing on here. Now, if you look at this visualization of Central Florida, you can see the years going across at the top of the screen, and you can see this classification that we have created based on these 3 layers and kind of how that development is growing back at 2001 here and going up. So there'll be a few more slides like this, so follow this theme where you're watching the years, and I'll let it sit on the slide for a minute so you guys can look a little bit more closely. So here we'll zoom in on the Sarasota area. This is very apparent, the increase in development in these areas. Here we're only showing natural and developed. And when you drive out in those areas, you can see even today, it's pushed out even further than that as new developments are coming on. So we're trying to take the best available data and use these tools to try and understand what's happening. Another example around Jacksonville. So one thing that you may have noticed in these graphs is that you can, or these maps, is that you can really see the recession. Things slow down and then they start to pick up again. So we've got this chart here, and if you look at the top line, that is the cumulative number of acres converted from natural to developed. And so you can see there, right around 2008 through to 2013, it sort of decreases in how sharp the curve is there, showing that the market is crashing. So again, this is cumulative number of acres, so adding on. And then after 2013, moving forward, we have this steep line. So this is showing increase in development. And who knows what the next one will look like beyond that. So some limitations and considerations. The NLCD approach is really, really great for looking at the past to understand trends. Again, most recent from 2019. And at a 30-meter resolution. So Steve Brumby, again, in his Impact Observatory panel yesterday, was talking about their data set, which is using the Sentinel-2 satellite imagery, which is 10-meter resolution. AI-driven, really, really good, and on an annual basis. So right now they've got products from 2017 to 2021, so we want to use that and try and find ways to partner with them to get some of that more real-time data access to show this. Now, their accuracy is also not perfect, and so one of the things that we've been speaking with them about is trying to partner with them to help inform their land cover classification, use our knowledge of the lands that we work on at Archbold in the headwaters of the Everglades and beyond to train their land cover classification to really make sure that it is really, really accurate. You know, the tools that they're using right now it's a global model, and so we want to try and refine it really for Florida. The second project that we are working on that I want to touch on right now is a really exciting opportunity, and we are working and partnering with Conservation Florida to try and bring together all of the information that conservation practitioners on the ground need to make decisions to speak with landowners and actually get land acquisition moving. The way it's described to me is these land trusts will have so many different places that they need to go and look for data to try and get all of the data that they need to compiled so that they can go and speak to a landowner about the opportunities that they might have. So this includes real estate data, environmental data, and so much of that is coming from FNA and John Otting. And then different acquisition opportunities as well. And we learn about how many of them are out there and how many are underutilized as well in the state right now. So compiling all of that information together into an ArcGIS hub so that the land trusts can then use that to enable faster acquisitions. So we're partnering with Conservation Florida to push this effort forward, and then they will create outreach to all of the other land trusts working in the corridor to be able to utilize this tool. So it's really, really exciting, and potentially even including some of that impact observatory real-time change data to see how things are being developed, just so that everyone has all the tools that they need at their fingertips. And what's even more exciting is that there is another initiative going on right now. It is called the Land Rise Initiative, and it is being put on by the College of William and Mary and the Lincoln Institute. And they basically came to the same conclusion that we came to, that at a national scale, we needed this centralized location for all of this information. And so I approached them and I said, hey guys, we are trying to do something similar in Florida. And they got really excited about Florida kind of being a pilot project for this national database. And so we're going to lead the way and show everyone what can be done. And Florida has such a rich repository of data in this area that we can really help lead the way into this national initiative, which is really, really exciting. So with that, I just want to acknowledge a few people that have worked on these projects, and that is all I have.
Great, thank you. Great. So in terms of data and tracking, a few questions as we begin to wrap for folks, if you have them. Any questions from folks? Hillary, keep bringing the mic down.
So, John, I was interested in your supplemental information, and just thinking a little bit, you said, well, we don't need to worry about those areas because they've sort of got some degree of protection. But I also thought, you know, our observation is that people who are engaged in PES are sometimes actually sort of, that is the gateway to doing an easement or something. So I wouldn't want to dismiss it. It's often a sort of halfway house, and there may be other supplementals that might be in that category. So I know you're aware of this, but just sort of sounding that note of caution. The other thing that I think really should be in those, or would love to think about being in those supplementals, is the dang TDRs. I mean, so many counties have got terrible tracking of TDRs that they've done in the past. And, you know, they're all in the building files. They're not on some kind of tracking system, at least in the rural counties. And I've had to keep on reminding them, hey, you actually did a TDR on this. You can't actually now come and develop it. So that would be something that would be really helpful to have tracked in the supplemental.
Yeah, that would be our goal. I was kind of lumping that into the broader concept of regulatory set-asides. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but to the extent we can find that information and compile it, we're going to try and do that.
Great, great questions. Final question for our folks today? All right, we've worn them out. All right, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Great work. A lot of applause for panelists.